The rain came in sheets, relentless and unforgiving, transforming the city into a glistening labyrinth of reflections. The streets, once bustling, were now subdued, as if even the pavement was tired of the constant noise of human life. Under a faint awning outside Jerry's 24-hour diner sat Elijah Carter, a figure who seemed almost out of place amidst the drab surroundings. This story unfolds to reveal the shocking truth behind his hidden past and the incredible power he holds. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more unbelievable stories like this. His clothes were ragged, his jacket tattered and worn, but his eyes, those eyes were sharp. People who passed him often hurried along, a quiet unease in their step. The subtle aura of authority he carried made them avert their gaze quickly. Elijah wasn't just another homeless man. He was a man of the past, a man with a story that the world had chosen to forget. But that story, it was one of unimaginable skill, of a sniper whose precision could alter the course of wars. As the city drowned in the downpour, Elijah remained motionless, his focus unbroken. The world around him was a series of calculations, the hurried woman clutching her purse, the young couple laughing as they dodged puddles, the occasional car driving by. His mind was still, but always alert. Each movement, each sound, was absorbed. His posture, though unassuming, still held the discipline of someone who had once been at the top of his field. And then they arrived. 4 officers in uniform, their boots hitting the wet ground with the kind of rhythm that only comes from authority. The lead officer, Travis Boone, had an air of arrogance about him. His eyes scanned the street and landed on Elijah, a smirk spreading across his face. The kind of smirk that only someone with little understanding of the person in front of them could possess. Well, Boone drawled, walking toward Elijah. Look what we have here, boys. This spot's not a hotel. Elijah didn't flinch. His gaze remained distant, unmoved by the presence of the officers. Boone, sensing a challenge, leaned closer, his voice turning harsher. I'm talking to you, old man. You deaf or just stupid? Elijah's voice, when it came, was calm and composed. Neither, sir, he replied, each word clear and deliberate. The younger officer, Reynolds, exchanged an uncomfortable glance with his companions. But Boone didn't seem to notice. He was too busy trying to assert his dominance. He kicked Elijah's duffel bag, sending it sliding across the wet sidewalk, its contents spilling out into the rain. Personal items, Elijah said quietly. His eyes tracked the bag, but there was no panic. He didn't need to explain himself further. Boone's sneer deepened. What's so special about this? Boone asked, picking up a set of dog tags from the wet ground, dangling them in front of Elijah. Military, huh? Just another bum who couldn't hack it in civilian life. For a split second, there was a flicker in Elijah's eyes, something cold and calculating. He remained silent, standing his ground. You should put those back, he said, his tone measured. Boone scoffed, letting the tags fall into a puddle. You gonna fight the whole department, old man? Elijah didn't move, his body tense but still. The kind of stillness that suggested years of training, years of discipline. His eyes never left Boone's face. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't intimidated, but he was done. What happened next was swift, almost too quick to register. The moment Boone touched Elijah, it was like everything stopped for a brief second. The officers, eager to assert their control, rushed forward. Elijah didn't resist, not at first. But in that moment, his mind was already calculating. As they took him down to the wet pavement, the rain mixing with the blood running from his face, Elijah remained eerily quiet. His body hit the ground with the familiar thud of someone who had fallen before, but he didn't scream. He didn't beg. Instead, he closed his eyes, counted in his head, and waited. His memories began to surface, flashing like a series of images through his mind. A world of sand-colored hills. A scope. The crosshairs settling on a warlord's head from 800 yards away. the exhale of controlled breath as the trigger squeezed. The memories of his past life were clear, vivid, and sharp. They had been buried deep inside him, hidden away, but now they began to emerge. "Not so tough now, huh?" Boone sneered, cuffing Elijah's hands behind his back with unnecessary force. The officer's laughter echoed around him, but Elijah remained focused. He was no longer just a man on the street. He was Elijah Carter, the most lethal Green Beret Sniper in history. As they shoved him toward the patrol car, his belongings forgotten in the gutter, Elijah's eyes locked onto Officer Reynolds. The young officer had been the most uncomfortable of them all, and now he couldn't meet Elijah's gaze. The car doors slammed shut, and as they drove away, the silence in the vehicle was palpable. Elijah's presence was heavy, his stillness unnerving. Reynolds, sitting in the front seat, couldn't shake the feeling that he was driving a man far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. "What are you going to do about it?" Boone mocked, but there was no response from Elijah. His words weren't threats. They were warnings. By the time they reached the holding cell, the rain had slowed, but the tension in the air had not. Elijah sat alone in his cell, his posture straight despite the blood that had dried on his face. The cell, smelling of bleach and despair, held memories of other places, other times. Elijah had seen worse. He had been through worse. The confinement didn't bother him. The officers may have believed they had subdued him, but they were wrong. Elijah Carter wasn't hiding from the world. He was hiding the world from himself. Reynolds, who had remained silent the entire drive, couldn't shake the growing sense of unease. The man they had arrested wasn't just a homeless person. He wasn't just a war veteran. He was something more, something dangerous. And now, as he sat there, seemingly at ease, the truth became clear. The world had underestimated Elijah Carter. They had mistaken him for just another broken soul on the streets. But what they didn't know was that Elijah wasn't running from the past. He had simply chosen to step away from the violence, to live a life without the constant noise of warfare. But now, faced with disrespect and humiliation, the calm facade he had built was cracking. His training, his discipline, his lethal precision, it was all returning. And when the time came, when it was truly necessary, Elijah Carter would not hesitate. This wasn't just a story about a man who had fallen. It was a story about resilience, about the strength to rise again. Elijah had chosen peace, but he wasn't afraid to defend it when pushed too far. The real lesson here wasn't about violence. It was about understanding that every person, no matter how low they may seem, carries within them a story of strength. Elijah's story was one of redemption, of stepping away from a life of killing to find peace, and in doing so, proving that the greatest power lies not in destruction, but in the ability to choose a different path. This was a man who had known war, but in the end, he chose something greater, peace, on his terms. By the time they reached the holding cell, the rain had slowed, but the tension in the air had not. Elijah sat alone in his cell, his posture straight despite the blood that had dried on his face. The cell, smelling of bleach and despair, held memories of other places, other times. Elijah had seen worse. He had been through worse. The confinement didn't bother him. The officers may have believed they had subdued him, but they were wrong. Elijah Carter wasn't hiding from the world. He was hiding the world from himself. Reynolds, who had remained silent the entire drive, couldn't shake the growing sense of unease. The man they had arrested wasn't just a homeless person. He wasn't just a war veteran. He was something more, something dangerous. And now, as he sat there, seemingly at ease, the truth became clear. The world had underestimated Elijah Carter. They had mistaken him for just another broken soul on the streets. But what they didn't know was that Elijah wasn't running from the past. He had simply chosen to step away from the violence, to live a life without the constant noise of warfare. But now, faced with disrespect and humiliation, the calm facade he had built was cracking. His training, his discipline, his lethal precision, It was all returning. And when the time came, when it was truly necessary, Elijah Carter would not hesitate. This wasn't just a story about a man who had fallen. It was a story about resilience, about the strength to rise again. Elijah had chosen peace, but he wasn't afraid to defend it when pushed too far. The real lesson here wasn't about violence. It was about understanding that every person, no matter how low they may seem, carries within them a story of strength. Elijah's story was one of redemption, of stepping away from a life of killing to find peace, and in doing so, proving that the greatest power lies not in destruction, but in the ability to choose a different path. This was a man who had known war. But in the end, he chose something greater, peace, on his terms. Elijah Carter had lived 1,000 lives, each more dangerous than the last, and each one left him scared but sharper than the day before. He had been trained for one purpose, to be the perfect weapon. But what do you do when the mission ends, when you're no longer a soldier, and the only thing left is the memory of lives taken, choices made, and the sheer weight of what you've become? The world had forgotten him, or perhaps it had just turned its back on him. It had been years since Elijah had seen action, years since he had donned the uniform of the Green Beret and felt the rush of a mission that made him feel alive. He had walked away from it all, seeking peace in the anonymity of homelessness. But peace had never come. The silence between the gunshots and the combat had only amplified the weight of his past. Every night was a battlefield of its own, his mind racing, replaying old missions, old faces, and the feeling of being a weapon in a world that didn't know what to do with him. They didn't know who he was. They didn't know what he was. As Elijah sat under that dimly lit awning, his eyes took in every detail of the world around him, each second dissected and catalogued in his mind. The woman walking past, clutching her purse too tightly. The man glancing over his shoulder with fear in his eyes. The young couple laughing in the rain, carefree, naive. His mind was always on high alert, always calculating, always ready for the world to turn hostile. Old habits, like breathing, were hard to break. It was then that the patrol car pulled up in front of the diner, its sirens silent, but its presence more than enough to change the dynamic of the street. Elijah's gaze didn't flicker. He didn't move. The officers who emerged, stepping into the rain with the arrogance of men who believed they could control any situation, had no idea who they were about to confront. They only saw a homeless man, a nobody, someone beneath their notice. Officer Boone, the lead cop, locked eyes with Elijah as if seeing the very soul of the man before him. He sauntered toward Elijah, the smirk never leaving his face, and began with his usual taunts, the kind he'd used 1,000 times before on people he thought couldn't fight back. But Elijah wasn't like anyone Boone had ever encountered. The stillness of his figure, the way he sat unmoving, eyes distant yet focused, rattled Boone. It wasn't the look of a man beaten by life. It was the look of a man who had survived it all, and come out harder than ever. The sneer on Boone's face faltered for a second, but he pushed forward, determined to have the last word. Then came the kick, unexpected, harsh, and without reason. Elijah's belongings scattered on the wet pavement, the bag slipping into the gutter, the contents spilling out. His eyes narrowed, but he didn't move. He didn't react. Personal items, Elijah had said, his voice calm but firm, a stark contrast to Boone's condescension. The officers laughed as they mocked him, tossing his life aside like it was nothing more than trash. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that this was no ordinary man. He wasn't just another broken soul wandering the streets. Elijah Carter had once been a predator, a Green Beret Sniper whose body count stretched across the world's deadliest battlefields. The moment the dog tags fell from his bag, everything shifted. It wasn't the weight of the metal that changed things. It was the weight of the man holding them, the man whose hands had once held a sniper rifle, taking out targets from miles away with precision only the deadliest soldiers possessed. The younger officer, Reynolds, shifted uneasily. His gaze kept flicking between Boone and Elijah. He had seen people broken down by the system, seen it with his own eyes. But this was different. There was something about Elijah that was too calculated, too focused. The way he looked at Boone wasn't just defiance. It was a warning. Don't underestimate me. But Boone didn't get it. He never did. His arrogance blinded him, and he pushed further. He taunted Elijah, pushing him with his baton, trying to provoke a reaction. But Elijah's response was nothing more than a quiet command, "Don't touch me." At that moment, everything about Boone's bravado collapsed. He had pushed too far, and Elijah wasn't the man he thought he was. Elijah wasn't just some homeless man. He wasn't a relic of a forgotten war. He was a weapon, honed and perfected, just waiting for someone to make the mistake of challenging him. The fight that followed was swift, calculated. Elijah's body moved with a fluidity that only a trained soldier could possess. The officers had expected a struggle. They'd expected a fight, even if it was one-sided. But what they didn't expect was how fast they would lose control of the situation. Boone's hand gripped Elijah's arm, but in the next instant, Boone was stumbling backward, thrown off balance by a move so quick and precise that it left him reeling. Elijah hadn't even moved at all, yet Boone was on the ground, his arrogance shattered. The other officers rushed in, their hands on their batons, ready to take down the old man. But they weren't dealing with just any man. They were dealing with a trained killer, a man who had learned long ago that violence wasn't about strength. It was about precision, and Elijah's precision was deadly. As they dragged him to the wet pavement, his face scraping against the cold concrete, Elijah's mind drifted. A flash of memory passed through his mind. Desert sands, the crosshairs of a sniper rifle settling on a target a mile away. He didn't hear the officers laughing. He didn't hear their insults. He was somewhere else, somewhere distant, where the only thing that mattered was the job. And in that moment, Elijah made a decision. He would not be broken. He would not be beaten. He was no longer the soldier he once was. But neither was he just a man. He was a predator. And predators don't go down easily. As they shoved him into the patrol car, bruised but not broken, Elijah's eyes met Reynolds for a split second. The young officer couldn't look away. The man in the back of the patrol car wasn't just a homeless man. He was a force of nature. And in that instant, Reynolds knew something the others didn't. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The predator had awakened, and the world had no idea what it had just unleashed. The jail cell was cold, a stark contrast to the fire that burned in Elijah's chest. As the hours ticked by, the world outside spun without him. And yet, it felt as if time had frozen in this one moment. His body was battered, bruised, but his mind was sharper than ever. The officers had underestimated him. They thought that by throwing him in a cage, they could break him, control him, contain him. They were wrong. They had no idea what kind of man they were dealing with. Elijah was more than just a soldier. He was a force of nature, a survivor whose resolve was unshakable, whose purpose was only beginning to resurface. The flashing lights outside the small window of his cell cast eerie shadows across the concrete walls. As he sat on the hard bench, the silence was deafening, yet his thoughts were a storm. How had he gotten here? He had always known that his past would catch up to him. But this wasn't the way he expected it to happen. A clash with petty officers on the streets. It was too small, too insignificant for a man of his caliber. He had been trained to move through shadows, to carry out missions that most would never hear of. He was a ghost, a weapon, until now. But even in the cold grip of that iron cell, Elijah could feel the change coming. The world outside had begun to shift, and he was no longer just a forgotten soldier. He was a man at the crossroads of two worlds, one that wanted him to remain invisible, broken, and forgotten, and another that would push him to embrace the darkness that had always lingered inside him. The door to his cell swung open with a metallic screech. A figure appeared in the doorway. Officer Reynolds. Elijah hadn't expected to see him again. The younger officer had been the only one who hadn't taunted him, the only one who had looked at him like he was more than just a discarded piece of society. "You're free to go," Reynolds said, his voice low, but there was something in his eyes, a mix of caution and curiosity. It wasn't just that Elijah had beaten their men. It was something deeper. Reynolds knew who he was, or at least who he had been. Elijah stood slowly, his body aching with every movement, but there was no hesitation in his step. The door swung shut behind him as they walked out into the dim hallway. Outside, the night air hit him like a shock to the senses, but it didn't faze him. Nothing ever did. "You're not like them," Reynolds said quietly as they stood just outside the police station, where the night felt too quiet, too still. Elijah glanced at the young officer, his expression unreadable. "You don't know me, kid. You think you do, but you don't." "I don't," Reynolds replied, "but I've seen enough to know that you're not just another man broken by life. You're not some homeless war vet stuck in the past. You're someone who's been hiding, waiting for a reason to step back into the world, and you won't stay hidden for long." Elijah didn't speak at first, the weight of those words lingering in the air. There was a moment of silence before he finally broke it. "I've been running from it, from what I was, what I'm capable of. But I'm done hiding. They think they can break me, push me into a corner and keep me there. But they don't know what's inside me, and they won't." Reynolds took a step closer, his voice low, almost like a warning. "Don't do this. Whatever it is you're planning, don't. You'll be just another ghost, just another soldier they'll erase from the world when it suits them. Don't become what they made you." Elijah's eyes locked onto his, a cold fire behind them. "I was never one of their ghosts, and I'm not anyone's casualty. I'm the storm they never saw coming. The world doesn't get to decide what happens to me anymore. I get to decide." For a moment, Reynolds stood there, his breath catching in his throat. He saw it then. He understood. Elijah wasn't just a victim of the system. He wasn't just a man who had fallen through the cracks. He was a man who had been forged in the fires of war, tempered by the worst the world could throw at him. And now he was standing at the edge of something much bigger than any of them could grasp. "Where will you go?" Reynolds asked, his voice softer now, more hesitant. He was trying to understand, trying to reach the man standing before him. But Elijah's answer came with a quiet finality. "Wherever they least expect me, and wherever I can make them feel what they've been running from." With that, Elijah turned and walked away, leaving the police officer standing in the shadows. The predator had awakened, but this time, there was no turning back. The world didn't get to choose his path anymore. Elijah would carve his own. And in the end, it wasn't the world that would break him. It would be the world that would break before him. The hunter had become the hunted, but only because the predator was ready to strike. He had been the weapon. Now he was the reckoning. And the world would never be the same again. This wasn't just a story of survival. It wasn't just about a man trying to find peace after years of war. This was the story of taking control when the world tries to bury you. This was the story of the strength to rise, to fight back, and to show the world that no matter how far you've fallen, you can always rise again and be the force that others fear. Because no matter how hard life tries to break you, the true measure of a man lies in his ability to rise up and make them regret ever thinking they could take him down.